Hello, boys and girls, and good evening. Tonight, we are going to discuss a very family friendly and delightful topic cannibalism, specifically cannibalism on film. Um, and why are we doing that? Because, well, I've been watching a lot of cannibal films lately. I find it quite fascinating from a creative perspective, and I'm going to tell you why. So, first, a little overview of exactly what cannibalism constitutes and why I find it fascinating. I mean, I don't think I have to fully explain it just because it's so well known, but just in case you've been living under a rock for your whole life, or you are a rock and you can still somehow hear me, which is a miraculous feat. Anyway, so cannibalism is when one species consumes members of its own species. And I have to broaden it like that because humans are not the only ones that do that. Um, but when we do it, it's a little bit more unsettling, I suppose, because we do have the capacity to think and rationalize and express our thoughts via spoken language and things like that. We have the ability to reason. But what I find so fascinating about cannibalism is that it is something that is remarkably common across the world and throughout history, and yet it hasn't been mainstream. Not really. Only in a few, kind of isolated tribes or in certain situations, like maybe eating the heart of a conquered enemy, that, something the royal family would do, or like mummies would be ground up and used for medicinal purposes, and that was in the West, so that wasn't even in an isolated tribe or anything. But isn't it amusing that we as human beings, we have these abominable, horrific things like cannibalism and like slavery that have continued to follow us throughout our history on this planet, and both cannibalism and slavery have existed in pretty much every society known to man in every part of the world since you know since recorded history or even before. And yet slavery was most definitely mainstreamed and institutionalized and systematized, and we know that all too well in the United States. But cannibalism, despite being as common, was still always seen as pretty much always taboo. Isn't that interesting? And why is that? Well, it's an unsettling idea, but also, if one were to eat a human brain, there's a high risk of catching something known as kuru, which is essentially the human equivalent of mad cow disease. And it just the mention of it often kind of weirds people out. Now, assuming that one were to take that out of it and one were to just talk about the taste and the nutritional value, well, apparently, having not partaken and not planning to, apparently human meat, depending on how healthy the person is, apparently human meat can be quite delicious and nutritious. But I doubt that one would necessarily want to make a habit out of it for health reasons, if not the obvious moral reasons. And, don't want to go to jail either, because it is murder. But anyway, that's a little overview of cannibalism itself. But what I find so interesting about it, besides its commonality, is the fact that, well, it is very primal. You do see examples of cannibalism in other species. It is very, well, for lack of a better word, animalistic. It is very taboo, obviously, but also there's just something about the power of it, about one human consuming another person and having total control over them and owning them forever, essentially, absorbing them into themselves. That's why Jeffrey Dahmer said that when he ate people's body parts, that he felt like they were becoming a permanent part of him and they would never abandon him, because he had a lot of abandonment issues and among other many other issues, but that was a pretty key element of his psychology. But I just find that interesting because it is so predatory and primal, but it is also about power. And then in certain ways, there's something of a sexual element to it. There is something as a cannibal fetish, where people either get aroused by the act itself or the fantasy of it, the thought of it, the idea of it. And we'll touch on a little bit of that in some of the films. More so in the sense of blending some aspects of human sexuality and death by cannibalism rather than the fantasy or the fetish aspect. But still, it's an interesting thing whenever sex and death tend to follow each other. Well, it's life and it's death, and you can get into kind of a Taoist, yin yang connection between all of them, if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But we are not here to do that. We are here to talk about cannibalism on film. Now, I'm just going to talk about some of the films that I have in my collection that have to deal with cannibalism in some form or fashion. And just to start off with some of the obvious ones, just to get them out of the way, we're going to talk very briefly about the Hannibal Lecter film and TV series. And I say briefly because Hannibal Lecter as a character, yes, he's a cannibal, but the genre of his novels and films and TV series, they fit very squarely into serial killer fiction and into thriller that has elements of horror or vice versa, however you want to look at it. And they don't really fit into what was known as like the Amazonian cannibal genre from the 70s and 80s, which in terms of film is mostly what people know. But again, it's a wider berth than a lot of people think. Has wider reaching consequences, so we're gonna just start with the most obvious ones. First up, obviously, being Manhunter, which was Michael Mann, and Hannibal Lecter was played by Brian Cox. Now, he is never mentioned to be a cannibal in this film. He is mentioned as having been a serial killer that Will Graham caught and who's helping him catch the Tooth Fairy, but he's not ever explicitly mentioned as a cannibal. And I'm not sure if that was because it didn't fit the aesthetic of it, or I haven't read Red Dragon, the book on which this is based. I would imagine it is mentioned there, but I don't know if it was one of those like studio mandated things that they remove, or if the director if Michael Mann didn't really see it fitting in. I'll say this: it would have perhaps been a little weird, just because this is like a very '80s thriller, kind of more like crime thriller. Like, it has a lot of Miami Vice kind of feeling to it with the synth score and just the neon look, and it's really good for what it is, but it definitely doesn't fit in with the Hannibal Lecter that we know and love that was brought to life by Anthony Hopkins. Now, Brian Cox, his Hannibal Lecter is probably the most realistic Hannibal Lecter, because he comes across like someone that one could conceivably find in maximum security prison. He's intelligent, but he is not overly charismatic or overly. He's a genius. He has a genius level intellect, but he's not like a supervillain really. He actually has some really interesting mannerisms, because he kind of has the shifty eyes. Sometimes he kind of cuts people off very slightly, or he seems like he doesn't quite hear them, or just interesting little mannerisms that that Brian Cox based on a real British criminal. His name I can't remember, but interesting stuff. But yeah, not explicitly mentioned as a cannibal, unlike The Silence of the Lambs, one of my favorite films of all time, and if you count it as a horror film, easily my favorite horror film of all time. And this Hannibal Lecter, without gushing too much about how I love everything in this film, without gushing too much about that, this Hannibal Lecter was really the game changer. And you could almost think of this as like something of a reboot of the series, before we use that term. But the interesting thing here, so what Anthony Hopkins, what he did with this character was he really elevated it to a whole other level. And it was Jonathan Demme, the director, who specifically wanted Anthony Hopkins because he'd seen him in one of my other favorite films, The Elephant Man, and he asked himself, well, what if the good doctor that he played in that film, what if the good doctor went horribly wrong one day? And so that was a starting point for Anthony Hopkins. And Anthony Hopkins, if you know his acting background, he was very much, a classically trained actor. He was in The Lion in Winter. He was in The Elephant Man, as mentioned before. He was, I believe, in The Bounty alongside Mel Gibson, which was a remake of The Mutiny on the Bounty. And he very classically trained on the stage. I believe he was in the Royal Shakespeare Company, if I'm not mistaken. Performed on the National Theatre in London, and so he really does bring a gravitas to the role that someone else might not have. And and what's so great is the way he's written and the way he's portrayed is that Hannibal Lecter embodies so many of the best and the worst characteristics that a human being can have, as Rob Ager, a great YouTuber, as he pointed out, because he can be quite sadistic and cruel, like when he ate the nurse's tongue and his pulse never got above 85. But he can also be incredibly nurturing and kind of help Clarice Starling heal from her wounds in order for her to become the great FBI agent that she can be. And he has kind of a form of love for her in the sense that I think he admires the fact that, and Anthony Hopkins said this, he admires her courage, and it's sort of the Beauty and the Beast archetype, that this particular beauty had the courage to see the beast and not be afraid of him. And now, as far as the cannibalism goes, I think that establishing those, like, that odd mix of high order and low order instincts, you get a very interesting sense that when he's eating someone, that it is coming from a place of sadism, and yet it also is coming from a place of refinement and elegance, which this Hannibal Lecter absolutely embodies. And so you could almost read into it, especially as we progress through the Anthony Hopkins Hannibal Lecter series, you could almost read into it something of a commentary on class and on the refinement. I think there was a quote of Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil that he was arguing that almost all higher culture is based on cruelty, which was referenced in A Fish Called Wanda. And so you could almost read that into it, and that's especially the case in a film that we'll get to later. But yeah, they don't ever go into why he eats people, or even, they only hint at it. In part of it is so your imagination can fill in the blanks, but there's such a air of mystery and gravitas to that Hannibal Lecter. Then when we get to Hannibal, the sequel, based on the sequel novel, here we get more of a portrayal of Hannibal the monster, which we got some of, and we certainly got a lot of build-up related to it in the first film. But here we see it more, but we also do see the monster hiding in plain sight in a way. So you do still get that duality. And, in terms of cannibalism, you see much more grotesquerie in the sense that you see explicitly the results of one of his cannibalistic encounters, someone who survived their encounter with Hannibal, which is Mason Verger, whose face is horrifically deformed, and he's just barely being kept alive because of what happened, with, which actually, no, it was, Hannibal had him in a, I believe he was on drugs or something, but he had him carve up his own face, which is actually even more messed up. But that also goes back to that cruelty side, and also the fact that he doesn't have to eat people all the time, which again, that does kind of further complicate his reasons for eating people, which part of it is that mystery element that does get explored later. But in here you see him having sawed, Ray Liotta's skull, having pulled it off, cutting into the brain and frying it up and eating a piece, which, he would most certainly not survive on, even if even if you didn't have to think about all the internal bleeding and the brain damage, he would have most certainly caught something, I'm sure. But yeah, you get more of Hannibal the monster and Hannibal's uglier aspects, despite the fact that he is also hiding in plain sight. And I do like that contrast. And I like this movie more than a lot of people do. I don't think it's the best in the series by any means, but the last film, it's like, how can you possibly top that? And then with Red Dragon, the remake slash re-adaptation of the novel Red Dragon, here they do more of an attempt to blend the original Red Dragon story with the beautiful portrayal and continuity that was established through Silence of the Lambs. So it was Brett Ratner who, we can't really talk about him right now, but it was Brett Ratner who did a surprisingly effective job of not reinventing the wheel, but just carrying on the iconography and the legacy and just the feel of what Jonathan Demme had set up. And normally I'm a fan of people that kind of go off in their own direction, but as far as carrying on the torch, did a good job of doing that. Because Hannibal here with Ridley Scott at the helm, like it or not, he did do much of his own thing with it. And the people writing this were David Mamet and Steve Zalian, so they were not slouches in the screenwriting department. But with Red Dragon here, because Hannibal Lecter never escapes or anything, all of the cannibal stuff happens in the beginning, kind of the prologue to everything. And there is where you get into some of the class element that I was talking about, because Hannibal is very much part of the Baltimore, Maryland up and ups, the higher class, the snobs. And so part of his great kind of cosmic existential joke at their expense is that he's essentially feeding them back to each other in the forms of his dinners that he throws. And he is quite a culinary expert, and yet he's sort of mocking their status and their sophistication, even though he is quite sophisticated himself. So yeah, he does have a very, very dark sense of humor, which I very much appreciate because I do too. But yeah, he never escapes prison in this film, and yet he's still a threat, which is pretty cool. But yeah, so again, you get a different element of the cannibalism that as it manifests for him, but in a more satirical, classist kind of sense. It's almost like satire the way he's doing it. And then we get the last of the film series, the prequel film Hannibal Rising, in which we have a different actor portraying Hannibal Lecter, and his name is Gaspard Ulel. I don't know how to pronounce his name, sorry. I believe he's a French actor, but this was based on the prequel novel, and it explains once and for all exactly why Hannibal eats people, and it was brought about by childhood trauma related to Nazis in World War II having basically fed his sister to him without him consciously remembering it. It's a repressed memory that he eventually does remember. And, because he loved his sister so much and he loved his family, he hunts them down and kills them all. And eventually, once that repressed memory comes back, he becomes a cannibal himself. And, it's interesting. This is definitely the worst of the series. I don't think it's a complete train wreck or anything like it was. Gong Li is, she's beautiful in this. And it definitely makes use of its European setting. The fact that we have like his foster mother slash kind of sort of lover. Eventually, she's Japanese in a time and place where her having been there would have been very uncommon, and she kind of helps to train him, and he has like this proto mask that is an Oni mask, and I think that was a cool touch. In a weird way, you could have called this Hannibal Begins, because it does have some Batman Begins aspects to it, Hadn't really looked at it that way before, but it's true. Um, but yeah, some people thought that it took the mystery out of his character by having us figure out why he eats people. I think it probably could have been a little bit more extensive than that, at least to me, but it's serviceable. Like I could buy that great trauma might do that to somebody. And then, last but not least, we have the TV series Hannibal, in which we have Mads Mikkelsen playing Hannibal. And I have to admit, I have not finished the series yet. I got part ways into it, but then, of course, as things often do, other things popped up, and I kind of lost track. But from what I have been able to discern, this Hannibal seems to be different sort of person in the sense that he also is hiding in plain sight, but he also is a little bit more, I guess you could say, almost emotionally vulnerable, or he's at least projecting the facade of that. But again, also hiding in plain sight, and so I think that's interesting. But again, I can't really fully comment on it until I finish the whole series. But I like what I have seen of it. At any rate, so we had to get Hannibal Lecter out of the way just because that's the most readily obvious thing. And then we'll briefly touch on a few. You could almost say they're more like genre fusions. These ones that are a little bit closer to the traditional cannibal film, um, but they fuse it with something else. So, just very quickly, we'll talk about Bone Tomahawk here, which we unboxed a little while ago. And this is predominantly a Western and a really darn good one. But what sets it apart is that it also has a lot in common with, and we might as well just talk about these together, The Hills Have Eyes. It has a lot in common with that, because this also touches upon cannibalism, but of a very different variety, because in here and in Bone Tomahawk both deal with these groups of people, a kind of a group of very heavily inbred, kind of isolated group of Native Americans that aren't really part of any other tribe. They're just kind of this weird offshoot of like these, and it's really weird because they have this like whistle thing that they have like jammed into their trachea basically, to where they can like, I can't even imitate it, but they make this weird noise that they can signal each other, and they like impregnate their own mothers, and it's all this, and like blind them, and it's all really really grotesque, but it's fantastic, and they make for terrifying antagonists. And they do hint at the cannibalistic aspects based on what we're told in the bones and all that. um, it's not quite what it could have been, but it definitely counts. And similar with The Hills Have Eyes, and I have to confess I've not watched the remakes yet, but just threw them in there. But yeah, The Hills Have Eyes. Similar thing. These inbred people that are offshoots of no tribe in particular, no group of people in particular. They're living in the wilderness, in the desert, well, in both films. And then with this, it's sort of a exploitation fusion of things. Got some slasher elements, but not really. It's a very unique film. A little bit of some comedic elements in here as well, but similar kind of thing, inbred. And they want to eat a baby because I guess baby meat's really tender, which apparently in real life the meat of children is kind of squishy like fish, from what I've looked into it. But yeah, so yeah, we just briefly touched upon that. Now we can talk about the cannibal genre proper. And I have to make a little confession here. I've not yet finished Cannibal Girls, this Ivan Reitman horror comedy here. But it is a horror spoof, a couple on a romantic holiday who settle into a quaint little bed and breakfast run by a trio of flesh-eating ladies who fancy them for tomorrow's menu, which, haven't we all been in that situation? But yeah, I have to admit that I haven't finished this yet. Something came up, of course, but there's an example of that's about as explicit as can get. Cannibal Girls, it tells you exactly what it's about. Um, but it's done for the sake of comedy, and this was Ivan Reitman before he did Ghostbusters. And then I have to admit I haven't watched this one yet, but think just based on the cover and the stills on the back, it seems like it covers off much of the territory that we'll cover with the ones that I have watched. But it is Slave of the Cannibal God, and it says it's anthropologist in New Guinea, and people go on to find him when one of them goes missing. And this is a little bit of what I was talking about, with some aspects of death and sexuality, and specifically the kind of the consumption of one person. So you've got very clear sexualization there, and it's just an interesting fusion, I think. We'll talk about that a little bit more with the ones I have seen, and I'm sorry that I haven't seen this one yet. I love the artwork, though. It's gorgeous. Alright, so the ones that I have watched, there's still plenty more. So I don't think you could say this was, I don't know if this would count as the first one, but it was most definitely one of the first. I don't happen to have the full list of cannibal films in front of me, but this one was most definitely one of the earliest ones. This title that's on the Blu-ray and is very commonly known by this title of Jungle Holocaust. But on screen, when you play this, it says Last Cannibal World, and that's a more direct translation of what the original Italian title was. And with this one, you have a lot of tropes that would later become pretty well established with the genre, where it's Westerners who either explicitly go to the Amazon to, like, whatever it is, film a documentary, do a thesis, look for somebody that went missing, something like that. Here it's, they're going to look for someone that went missing. Their plane runs out of gas, and it kind of makes a rough landing, but it's not unsalvageable. But, one by one they get separated, and they get, eaten or killed by the cannibals in the Amazon. And it's up to our hero to figure out how to escape and get back to the plane and get out of there. Pretty basic stuff, but interestingly enough, so we saw our example of some boob action going on there. Interestingly enough, we kind of have the opposite situation in this film, where our hero, he's stark ass naked for most of the movie, and you see all the bits and pieces you'd expect. And that's kind of refreshing, but also you do get, there's a lot of nudity in this film, but it's very rarely of a sexual nature. It's mostly just the fact that, well, they're in the Amazon, and you wear anything more than like one loincloth and you're going to be burning up. So yeah, a lot of nudity amongst like the children, the women, the men, but very little of it is sexual in nature. But then you've got some, this is where you get into more of like kind of the classical ritualistic types of cannibalism, where a lot of the time they'll kill someone or an animal or something, which it's not cannibalism if it's another animal, but you'll get that where they want to have it raw. And I highly doubt that is hygienic, or people that have practiced cannibalism in real life, I don't know if they do that, or if they cook it first. I would hope that they would at least cook it. But anyway, you get more of those kinds of tropes in here. You have our hero who is, I think, he's captured and he's not, going to be eaten right away. And I think part of it is that they want to, well, fatten him up, but they also, I remember, they were wanting to use him as bait for, I believe, a crocodile, which is interesting. But anyway, then you get some of the sexual aspects of it besides just all the nudity. But like one of the native girls, who's like, very attractive, of course, like I don't know why, but she like, fondles him. And then when he takes her out when they go on the run, and he like rapes her, and yet she sticks around with him. and you're never really sure if it's because she actually likes him or if it's because she's trying to trick them. She does eventually get killed, spoilers, and is eaten by her own people. And plus, our hero, in a kind of fit of aggression and all that stuff, he actually eats the flesh of one of his the people trying to kill him, one of the natives, and so it's another kind of statement about how the quote unquote civilized man can partake in this as well. Um, but yeah, as far as one of the earlier cannibal films, this one's pretty good. It is one of the better made ones, I think. Um, Now it does have its things about it that it wouldn't really do well today, like the rape. Anytime you do rape in a story, it carries a lot of weight, obviously. So you have to do it very carefully. Plus the fact that you do see on-screen animal death. Now it's nowhere near as sadistic as some of the later ones we'll talk about, and a lot of it honestly looks like they spliced in unrelated nature footage. Um, it really does look like that. Now there are some things that you can tell that they were, killing like an alligator live for real. But you get more the sense that it's done for survival for the meat that this creature has, and it's not really anything more or less complicated than that. But again, you would never do that on film today. Even though in context it's it at least has a purpose in the story and it's not sadistic really, but still you would never want to kill an animal on screen. um, and then probably the least shocking in the cannibalism aspects, at least, but far more in the sexuality aspects, was this 1977 film called Emmanuelle and the Last Cannibals, which, oh boy, boobies, freak out. Um, anyway, this film was a Joe D'Amato film, and it was an interesting attempt to kind of blend the erotic and cannibal genres together. What an interesting fusion. And this was Laura Gemser. She had played Black Emmanuelle in some of those Emmanuelle knockoff films that were popular at the time, because Emmanuelle was an unrelated, different spelling and had two M's. But it was a different series of like French erotic films, and then they made knockoffs with Laura Gemser, and this was one of the installments, and it was an attempt to fuse the erotic genre with the cannibalism genre. And what you end up getting is something that is much more of an erotic film than it is of a cannibal film. Excuse me. Yeah, you get more of that than you get of actual cannibalism in here, and the little bits of cannibalism that you get at the end are very, they like the makeup isn't really convincing, and they haven't really done all the sufficient build up to make it really scary or disturbing. And it's says that she discovers evidence of an extinct cannibal tribe in a Manhattan mental hospital, because Emmanuelle's a journalist, and they go down to the Amazon to investigate. And I mentioned that it's much more of an erotic film, and that's for sure because Laura Gemser is naked in quite a lot of this film, and she has to have been one of the most beautiful women of her time. Like, I'm not even kidding. She was absolutely beautiful. So I'm not complaining, but it's one of those things where it's very telling of its time, because there is a lot of nudity, but it's so clearly softcore, very obviously simulated. Nobody is, there's no penetration, there's no, nobody's, it doesn't show you everything you'd want to see. It's not in the realm of the senses, but it's just about it. It's like everything but it doesn't quite go all the way like you would think it would. But yeah, the actual cannibalism parts of this are few and far between, and what's there isn't really. It's clear where they put their focus, which I suppose is just as well, because it's like, well, if you had to err on the side of one or the other, better to focus on the part that might actually turn someone on. And Emmanuelle herself, Laura Gemser is, she does a good job with it, despite the fact that I have to say, could just be this release of it. I don't know. It's hard to tell with a lot of these Italian films of this era, but the dubbing in, well, actually both of these films, but this one especially is horrible at this, which is that, just for a little film history, Italian films from like I want to say like 50s, 60s, 70s, around that era, if not a little bit before or after. Um, it was very, very common for Italian films, they would cast like any actor from any part of the world, have them speak their native language on set, whatever that happened to be, and then they would have someone else later dub for them into whatever language was needed for whatever market, which in theory is not bad. I mean, technically that's what anime is, except that in anime, all the characters, they just move their mouths up and down like that, and there's very little in the way of specific contours of the mouth in order to articulate, specific modes of speech and specific words. So what you end up getting is a lot of dubbing that really doesn't match at all. And I tried to toggle between the English and the Italian in this, and either one that I chose, it didn't at all match up with what their lips were doing. So I just stuck with English because I'm like, well, fuck it. I'm not going to find the version of this that. I always try to watch films in their original language, but in this case, it's like pretty much impossible to because again, I think they're all speaking different languages relative to each other, which I can't even imagine doing a scene that way. Like you're with your scene partner, if they're speaking a language you don't understand, then you have to really know that script and just go off of what you remember. That seems like that would be a really just awful way to have to work, but that could just be me. So yeah, we're looking at these like roughly chronologically in terms of the actual like proper Amazon cannibal films. And we get to the big one, Cannibal Holocaust. Very, very important film in the world of horror filmmaking because it did pioneer the found footage genre. I think this is easily the crowning achievement of the cannibal genre because it does the sufficient build up. It does the build up very well. The storytelling structure is pretty different. It's pretty unique, but it also, and I'm saying that the structure of the story, not even the fact that it uses, quote unquote documentary footage, but because of all the build up that they do, all the setup that they do, when something disturbing happens, whether it is cannibalism or the killing of an animal or the killing of people or the dehumanization of the natives or whatever it is, they did the build up to it, and it creates a bridge in our minds that make it such that when we see an animal getting killed for real, then it makes it all the easier to accept that what's happening to the humans is real, even though it isn't. And again, the killing of the animals live on screen is still really, really rough to watch. And it's something that you could never do today and you shouldn't do today. And it's one of those things where it was a product of its time and the product of a director. What was his name? I can never remember his name. I'm sorry, I'm really bad with names on the spot. But it was I'm sorry. Ruggero Deodato. There you go. Sorry, that took forever. I'm bad with names sometimes. But anyway, yeah, it was definitely, I think, the best cannibal film that's ever been made. I don't think anything would ever top it. And definitely watch it if you think you can handle it, but prepare yourself for a lot of really sadistic, horrible animal death. But again, the makeup in this is really, really good. The spear here, the way that effect was done was actually pretty ingenious. They had her sitting on like a bicycle seat, and they had like a all that they had was like the end, just the very end of a spear, and she just held it in her mouth like that, and then this looked like it went in a very compromising place, and it didn't. But yeah, definitely check that out. And then very similarly, Cannibal Ferox, also very controversial, but for different reasons. There's not as much animal death in this. There is some. It's nowhere near as sadistic as Cannibal Holocaust, but it's more sadistic than in Jungle Holocaust. And here you see a guy's dick getting cut off, and I I wish I could say that the makeup effects were more convincing than they are. Um, but similarly with this and with Cannibal Holocaust, and with Jungle Holocaust, it's the idea of like that fresh meat and raw meat that they seem to want to go for rather than necessarily cooking things. Although um, they do, I think that I can't remember which one it was. Here's the problem: when you watch a lot of these back to back, they kind of run together in your mind. But one of these, I know, they like feed their friends back to them. I wish I could remember which one it was, but anyway, yeah, this one very similar. Now, now one thing that is before we move on to our last one thing that is a very common kind of criticism of these cannibal films from this era is that they have kind of a neo-colonial perspective in the sense that they look down upon the natives or whatever, and you could definitely make that argument, and they kind of try to go out of their way in both of these that they kind of explicitly ask who are the real cannibals, because in here they're both pretty on the nose about it, but like I think Cannibal Ferox is a little bit more, it doesn't do it as well um, in some ways in terms of the way that they state it, and yet the villain in this, he is quite sadistic and quite amoral, and so it's nice when we see his dick getting cut off, but also um, so it's in that case it's like through his behavior, and it's the behavior of one person, and then here you get the sense that, well, what the film crew was doing and the levels of depravity that they sank to, I think it's a little bit more powerful, and especially because it's done in that fake documentary style for much of, not all of the movie, but a decent enough portion of the movie. Because of that, it definitely lends more gravitas to the film's argument, I think. Which again, a little on the nose, but I think that it does makes that argument a little bit more effectively as far as the fact that like who are the real cannibals, and the oppression of or the the Westerners coming in and treating the natives inhumanely and that kind of thing. I think it makes that point a little bit more effectively. And then last up, we have Eli Roth's The Green Inferno, autographed by Eli Roth there. Another great artwork there from Scream Factory. And it's funny, out of all of the cannibal films we've looked at, that I've been able to talk about, there have been some that I haven't, but I will watch them very soon. Um, Now, out of all of these, this one I think is probably the most tame out of all of them. Um, it might have actually been this one where they feed, they eat some of their friends without realizing it. I wish I could remember, but anyway, the setup for this one I think is really good. It allows the cannibal genre to be modernized pretty effectively, I think, because it's these rainforest activists from college that go down to the Amazon without really understanding exactly what all they're in for, or they're way over their heads, because they are gonna chain themselves to these trees to prevent them from getting cut down, and they're afraid that they're gonna get shot, and it's like they're already way in over their heads prior to them having accomplished their goal, and they do, and they get back on the plane, they're ready to go home, and then it crashes, and oh boy, come into they come into contact with some truly terrifying cannibals. But in terms of the actual cannibalism itself, like it's not anywhere near as explicit as other ones in the series have been. There's no on-screen animal death. The natives and the people that are kidnapped and held prisoner, they are more clothed than other people in these other movies have been. Even though they get into some disturbing territory where they're gonna like do female genital mutilation, which unfortunately is a very, very common thing in many cultures around the world, and it's horrible, and the World Health Organization has, decried it, and rightfully so, but this isn't afraid to touch on the fact that that happens, and, the fact that our heroine is a virgin, and they have, like, this weird, sharp thing that goes up the up the vagina to test it. They don't shy away from the more disturbing aspects of there, but it's actually more tame than what we've seen. Certainly less sadistic than, say, where is it? Yeah, then certainly less sadistic than this, where there's like the hook through the boob and things like that, which that does get into some of the the sexualization aspects, but also the sadism aspects of it, which here you don't really get that. You get enough cannibalism action to where you're a happy guy if you're a cannibalism fan, especially with this guy that gets eaten. But it's such that it is able to do a satisfying homage without having to stoop to some of the more despicable aspects like the animal death or the rampant, kind of sexism or accusations of nativism, even or of whatever you call it, neocolonialism. Even though this did get some backlash for that, but it didn't have quite as much of a leg to stand on as some of the other ones would have. Now, in this film and in Cannibal Ferox, the main the final girl, she does not tell the truth about her experience because she doesn't want the natives to be eradicated. Because she's essentially trying to protect them, and like even though they did horrible things to her, it's like they don't deserve to be like exterminated or anything. That they have a certain degree of sovereignty over their own lands, and there are a lot of real isolated tribes today that effort is made. They're not necessarily cannibalistic tribes, but there is that effort made to kind of preserve their sovereignty and their just preserving the fact that they want to be isolated to a certain extent. But anyway, there's some cannibalism films for you. Hopefully, you found this interesting. Hopefully, you got some recommendations or some things you want to check out. There's plenty more that I don't have. Like, there's one called We Are What We Are. There's another one, Raw, which I remembered hearing about because it apparently made people physically sick. Because I guess it was really disgusting or something. I don't know. I do want to get that one. There's all kinds of them, and hopefully many more on the way because I think it's interesting. It's creatively largely a lot of untapped potential for what it can say about human nature and kind of the dark sides of human nature, the predatory sides of human nature. And then I guess you could throw in something like Dahmer or my what was the one I love the what was it, like My Friend Dahmer. It was fantastic. I didn't see just Dahmer, but I read the graphic novel and I saw the other the film adaptation, and it was about a real adaptation of the real life story of these classmates of Jeffrey Dahmer who really did know him when he was in high school, and they attempted to be his friend to varying degrees of success. And it's really, really fascinating. That was before he actually committed his first murders and before he committed his acts of cannibalism, but really good as far as like the foundation, the psychological foundation of somebody that would later go on to do horrible things. But yeah, I don't know if that would count, but it's just worth throwing in there. Really, really good film. But anyway, hopefully you found that interesting. Hopefully you got some good recommendations out of there. Hopefully you find the stuff as interesting as I do. So please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon, set phasers to stun, warp factor 5. I will see you in the next video, which will actually be quite shortly because I'm going to knock out another one of these tonight. So stay tuned.